Welcome to the Logistics Monk Show. I'm your host, Ryan Mohammed, aka the Logistics Monk. Last week, we had Jen, who was crushing it with her story on how she grew up in Canada and ended up in India with her coach throughout the world. As I'm doing these episodes, learning a lot about myself in terms of the conversations that I'm having with people, the engagement that we're getting from the audience and different peoples from all walks of life. And today's no exception. Today's an amazing day that we always kind of look forward to on Mondays when I can upload these episodes. But for me, it's the conversation and being able to interact with amazing people. Like I said, from the beginning, when I kind of started the show, I've just had a lot of friends because it's always easier to interview friends and bring them onto your show. But for me, as I'm kind of learning, as I'm kind of growing, because this is only episode 6 of our show, but the people that who've actually engaged with us has been amazing. So today we have somebody who's I'm blown away, and I know you're gonna find a treat with her coming on and sharing her story as well. If I was to go through her entire experience, you'd be mind blown because I think she's somebody who gives a lot more to our community than we actually think. When we started off this episode with Vinay, the Cutlass magazine, it's just opened up amazing doors, and we've been able to have great conversations with people. So, want to bring on Taij, who is Taij Moteelall, who's an amazing person. She is the founder and core leader of Standing in Our Power, as well as the co-founder and artist resident at Jahaji Sisters, which we will be getting into a little bit more deep here as well. And then finally, she's a co-founder and principal of Media Sutra. So, what doesn't she do? So that's why we have to bring her on the show and educate everybody on here. Good morning to everybody. We want to welcome Taij to the Logistics Monk Show. Good afternoon. How you doing, Taij?
Good afternoon, Ryan. Such a pleasure to be here. I love that intro.
Oh, thank you so much. No, it's really important that it comes from the heart for me, and it's engaging for everyone to understand where we're kind of coming from. Because when we had Crystal on a couple weeks ago, you didn't we were strangers at that point, and you promoted the show for us so much and able to kind of show that vibe. And every time I kind of see your profile, everything that you engage on, it's something that comes of a place of support. So let's get into that a little bit about that. So could you give me a little bit about those three amazing companies that you have basically founded and created a great message, and then we'll hop into today's conversation.
Hmm. Yeah, as you went through the names of the three entities, and I kept hearing co founder, one thing that comes up for me is that I'm a serial entrepreneur. And oftentimes it's because when I see some lemons, I'm able to, one of my magical superpowers is to turn it into lemonade, right? So a through line for all of those entities, ranging from nonprofit to for profit, is is really this sense of supporting those who are at the intersection of multiple oppressions and also are at the margins, right? When it comes to visibility, when it comes to power, when it comes to equity, right? When it comes to resources, when it comes to wellness, right? It is to how to take those who are at the very bottom or who are at the highest risk and lift up their voices and their vision. Because I believe that when we follow the leadership of those who are most impacted, everybody gets free, right? Everybody gets free. If we meet the needs of those who are most oppressed, most marginalized at the bottom, we all rise, right? Because you're lifting from the bottom. And I think that's the through line, whether it's working with Indo Caribbeans, right? My own people, because there's deep healing in that. Jahaji Sisters and Media Sutra has all been about lifting up my own people because I can't heal anybody else. I can't support anybody else to be well or to be resourced if I don't have an embodied experience with that,
Mm.
right? When I can become it, I can create it. So Media Sutra and Jahaji Sisters have been places for that. And similarly for our Standing in Our Power, Standing in Our Power works with women of color and gender expansive people of color. Again, those who are highest at risk and most marginalized. And yeah, that's been the through line for all three entities in my life, really.
Kudos to you. That is amazing to share. And as you were talking and kind of talking about the three entities, I was smiling because one motto that I live by, Tage, is lift as you climb. For me, I think it's extremely important. As you mentioned, like, you're lifting from the bottom. There's only greatness that can kind of come from it. Right. And as you kind of mentioned as well, that, if I can create it, I'm good with that. And I think that's amazing when you kind of look at the different entities that you work with. somebody would say that they look at something that you do right now and be like, wow, I'm so amazed at what Tage does with the three different entities. How does she get time? But for you, where does that come from? Like, where does, like, as we're kind of talking about different entities of like what your life has kind of looked like, did this come up for you, that wanting to help and lift other people? Did it come from like your parents? Did it come from your background? Can you talk a little bit to the audience a little bit about where your inspiration, your drive came from of wanting to lift others, especially those that we would consider at the bottom?
Mm, wow. Well, it's very, I think it's deeply personal where it comes from because all of my work is deeply personal. But when I think back about my formative years, and many of us are still who we were shaped to be in our formative years, from um, a mindset coaching approach, which is what I do. I understand that we don't become what we want, we become what we believe. And those beliefs are formed in a very early stage, oftentimes between the ages of 1 and 7, the formative years, and some say 1 and 17. And I think in my very tender formative years, I experienced some traumatic things. My father passed away when I was 1, and you can imagine how destabilizing that could be. Both of my families were in trauma. He was like the golden child of the family, the new love of my mom. And suddenly he was gone. He was the first one to pursue education and really start lifting the family out. He was a teacher, he was an artist. He did theater in his village and in the schools to help the poorest in his village and to help lift from the bottom. So while I lost him at an early age, his spirit and who he was continues to shape and guide me. But after he passed away, my mom chose a path of self determination and migrated to Canada and later the US. So I was separated from my parents. So I think that experience of trauma helped to cultivate my imagination and my creativity. And because I would make up these wonderful stories about my parents. And also, I think the experience of being dark skinned, growing up in a culture and a community that tends to think our freedom and our liberation depends on our proximity to whiteness. And we will more sooner lift up our oppressors, white people, and want to look like them and have fair skin when they're the ones who stole us, harmed us and put us into indentured servitude, which is another form of slavery. We still, as a people, want proximity to whiteness, and we look down upon our dark skin. So, as a young child, one of my nicknames was Blackie, and I was always made to feel that I was too dark or something was wrong to me, and I had to be in the shadows and I had to be hidden. But that experience also made me realize something in this world is not right.
Hmm.
So I started listening. I started trying to understand, why do we internalize so much self hate, right? The majority of our people are melanated, beautiful people. Why do we lift up and celebrate whiteness? So I started learning about, you know, colonialism and all those things. But when you ask what made me, pick this path and who I am, it's those tender experiences, which have also been very liberating. When I also tend to it's healing, right?
Mhm.
Wounds alone, you know, just fester and cause more harm. But when we tend to them and heal them, liberation is on the other side, possibilities on the other side.
Possibility and liberation. And the one thing that you said that I want to repeat was that you came from this based on trauma, right? Like losing your father at a young age, and like you're talking about your dad, and like these are definitely stories and things that you've heard from other people. I couldn't imagine what that's like to feel like that. Like your father's such a great person in the community, like you said, holding on the plays and being a community service member to lift people from the bottom, which you've definitely followed that. But then there's another part of that where you talk about your mom, right? That self discovery where she came to Canada, she came to the US as well to pursue a better life, to understand that my life back home, and I believe that you're from Guyana as well. So my home back home in Guyana, that's not for me alone. I want to aspire to different things. And just kudos to that for you understanding that. The part that you mentioned about like, that color. And I want the audience to kind of get a picture as well, because people might not, who are watching this, might not know what we kind of go through. But I remember as a kid, the things like, hey, don't stand out in the sun too long or you'll get dark, or or put on a hat, you don't want to get black, and even the words like you mentioned, your nickname was Blackie. I remember our dogs, right? You call your dogs Blackie if it was a black dog or something like that. But you're somebody who's so composed and somebody who's been able to give and provide to other people while you're healing your own internal trauma as well. Can you talk? I want the audience to really understand what does that really mean in terms of like that colorism. We're looking at the colonialism about like the white man or like the white power and like that, and then we look at us, and then we kind of fight. Sometimes there's an internal and an external battle between our own people that we think like we're kind of putting our shackles on ourselves. What have you seen even in like where you are right now in New York, because I feel like me as a Torontonian, the community, the West Indian community, Indo-Caribbean community in New York is very, very big and it's very tight. But anytime I go to New York, it feels like back home. So how do you feel like that? You're balancing that back home mentality versus, hey, we're in a completely different country right now, that is completely different and more progressive. It might be progressive to some people's opinions, but just to come back to it, Tage, what would your opinion be on something like that?
Just to get clear in the question of like, have we evolved, like
Yeah,
compared to like what we believe now versus back home?
that's correct. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Hmm. Well, I think it depends. I feel like those of us who have invested time into our wellness and into our healing, our mental health, and working on that mentality and to shift it, we have evolved, right? And many of us have also taken on the mantle and the work of creating spaces for the healing and the evolution of our people through, retreats and workshops and coaching, theater, the arts, all of that is healing. And I feel like there's some of us who, especially like our parents' generation who came and just had to hit the ground grinding, right? And just working multiple jobs. They paved the path for us and we're doing this work now. I feel like we have much more access, right, to all of these other tools and resources that we can bring into our community. And so I feel like it's a both end. Some of us have, and some of us are still on the journey.
Hmm. Some of us are going, and I like that you said that every people are at different points in life, as you kind of mentioned. Like I can only relate to my parents coming to Canada and they're kind of taking it off the ground. Like those multiple jobs, and you don't see it as a kid, obviously, right? But you see the sacrifices that they make and the comments that they've done. Can you walk me through, because like you said, you've created spaces and you continue to create spaces for people who don't feel maybe vulnerable, risk, or something that they can't really let their message get shown through. Can you walk me through what your experience was like? Was the first time you're like, I really got to make a difference in my community and I'm going to start this, whether it be with Jahaji Sisters, with the Media Sutra, as well as everything that you're doing. But what was that journey like? What were the feelings that you were feeling like that, hey, I've kind of made something that people, and how was it received by the community as well?
Hmm. Well, I think the first things I started weren't actually Midi Sutra, Jahaji, or Standing in Our Power. To take it back a step further, in college, I went to a college that was predominantly white. I was the only Indo-Caribbean person. The other people that looked like me were from the subcontinent. And, I got a lot of what we all get. Who are you? What are you? They just couldn't make sense of me. And that pushed me on a journey to really like learn about my history and my culture. I traveled back to India and then to Guyana and Trinidad to like really do my research. But really, the space that helped me to find my own power and to like be in inquiry and to be courageous was a group of women of color. In that sea of whiteness, we found each other. It was people from like Ethiopia, with lineages in Ethiopia, Peru, Honduras, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico. We all just came together. We were like, we needed each other. We were each other's lifelines. And we called ourselves the sisters. And we in Hampshire College where I went, we had houses. So we all decided to live in the same house together. We called it the Women of Color House. We were a place where we just brought people together, other students of color. We brought them in under our wings to help them with that isolation and a transition into a very white institution when we come from predominantly BIPOC spaces. And I think that was the first time. So it was this sense of community, and it even was the sense of what we refer to as Jahaji, right? Jahaji for me is chosen family, right? So our ancestors taught us one of the beautiful like experiences that they embody, that they've passed on to us, is this sense of family and chosen family. because on the boat, right, they didn't come with their birth family and their immediate lineages, but they became family. Jahaji Bai, brother of the boat, Jahaji Bahin, sister of the boat. And I feel like that's something that, like, I just kind of put it together, like, even at Hampshire College, like, in that place where I felt so alien and I felt so lost, it was building this community of women of color. And in that, I felt like I learned more in our house than I did in the classrooms because we shared about each other's history and cultures and stories. We dug into ourselves. It was really like a coming of age identity crisis situation for many of us. And we found each other and supported each other through it. And I felt like becoming an artist in that time, because poetry and writing has always been my outlets to process my emotions, but the emotions were so much now. I was learning about all these things. It was so exciting. So a whole body of poetry came through, and especially a body of poetry that paid homage to Indo-Caribbean women, because where I landed full circle was who was the Indo-Caribbean woman. And that was my thesis.
That was your thesis. So that was there. So you go to college, and like I said, it's predominantly white. And for those who are watching this, just imagine that, right? You kind of look at it, nowadays it's like the cool thing, right? Like everybody's eating doubles, everyone's talking about curry and turmeric lattes and all that stuff. But for me, I know for myself, when I don't think I saw another West Indian until I hit high school.
Mm.
Yeah, it was for me when I hit high school, and even then, it was weird to like walk like the halls and like hear like chutney music. I think Rakesh Shankaran came up with Mosi at that time, and it was like a sense of like home. So I can imagine for you when you had that house with like your women of color, it just felt like home sharing, even though it was different experiences. Like you said, somebody was Ethiopian and someone was from Dominican and different places, but their stories, there's always going to be some relevance in there. What happened? Like you said, you just did your thesis for kind of got into that path as poetry kind of took off your life. What was it like after you graduated, and what was it? Was there any kind of transition into like a work environment as being obviously somebody from there? Has there been any communication or any connections still to that woman of color house?
Yeah, I mean, we're still family. We have a little chat thing. We talk. They're the people outside of my immediate family that know me the best. They've known me since I was 17 and 18 when I started college. So yeah, I'm still in touch with them. But I think finding knowing who we are and being so rooted and anchored in that is such a sense of strength, right? And I feel like that's what college gave me. It sent me on this journey back to myself so I could be rooted, so I could be strong, so I could tap into that resilience. And after I was, our immigrant parents, they have these concepts of what is success and what they want us to be. So I was raised, I was going to be the lawyer, and my sister the doctor. My older sister became the doctor, and I became an artist, activist, and entrepreneur. So because my thesis was so in depth and I was traveling and doing all this oral history work in Guyana and Trinidad, I didn't quite get to be pre-law. So like take the LSATs and all that stuff and do it. So I decided I was going to take a year off, work in the legal industry, understand what it was about, and take my LSATs and then go to law school. I worked in corporate America, and everybody that I ran into was pretty much miserable. And women of color were at the bottom. And I was like, why would I want to put myself into this? I took the LSATs, I did really good. My mom trained us to be like, you got to succeed, you got to ace every exam. I'm a recovering perfectionist. um, and I was like, I don't want to do that. So I put my hat into one place only. It was New York University Gallatin School, where you create your own major. And I went there and I studied. I studied entrepreneurship at Stern Business School. I studied arts and theater and poetry at the Tisch School of the Arts, and then I also studied the history of like the role of the arts in movements and how the arts have always been an integral part of every social movement for change, because you can't create change without also shifting the hearts, the minds, and the spirits of the people, right? You can't just work at the mind level. So through music and through art, we also should move people at the heart level and spiritually, right? From the beginning of time, even on the plantations, it's what our ancestors did through drumming, through song. It brought joy to them. So at New York University is when I realized that I was like a legit artist. I wasn't just Taij. I wasn't just Taij writing my journal, writing some poetry here and there. I started getting on stage. Like I'd met a whole bunch of like artists of color, Breon Bain being one of them, who was Indo and Afro Trinidadian. It was a lot of them were Caribbean. Now that I think about it, and we wanted to create our own stage. Breon had a professor at Columbia, and he had a band and he was performing all the time. And he was talking to his professor, and his professor, Professor Kellis Parker, who's now an ancestor, said to him, "If you're tired of being treated like the hired help, why don't you build your own stage?" So he just started
Mm,
talking to people like a true organizing style. And I was one of them. And we all just like convened in a meeting and we're like, word, let's build our own stage. So we started organizing the first blackout. This notion of blackout is a blackout happens when the system fails us. The artificial light that is fed into our schools and social spaces is disconnected. We have to find light outside of those means in our own way. And our art and our creativity and our culture was that light. So we started like catalyzing radical imagination, visioning forward, creating art, and performing every month. I got up. My first spoken word poem was "Breathe Me In." It was an ode to the Indo-Caribbean goddess. And I said, "Breathe me in, tell me your story so I can know myself and I can in
mm.
turn tell your story."
I love that so much. I like the part that really resonated with me was that, hey, if you're tired of being the hired help, go build your own stage. And I can relate to that so much because even for me in my career, I was the same thing. I have so many resemblances to your career path where, hey, I went to corporate, I took accounting in college and I did my co op and I saw everybody so miserable. I
Mm,
was like, people are like, and it wasn't even tax time. So I don't know why they're so miserable because they should be
mm,
chilling, right? But for me, I just saw that and I knew that this wasn't for me. And I bounced and I bounced and I bounced. And logistics thankfully found me. And I found my home. I found my voice within logistics. But it does take that for you. And for me, when I was kind of talking about it with different people in our industry, I really connected with one of my he's my side not my sidekick but he's my right hand and his name is Ray and he's Guyanese as well and then sometimes we'd be at lunch together and we just talk about we don't really see West Indians in our career. Anytime in trucking, you see West Indians as maybe being the truck driver.
mm,
You're never seeing the guys kind of being like the executives and kind of doing boss stuff. So it was like for us, we kind of took that personally and just doing the same thing that you said. We built our own stage. We decided to like work together as a team, and then we just kind of evolved into different things. But just coming back to you, when it comes back to art, because like you said, your mom wanted the doctor and the lawyer, and you can't really fault for that because like she said she came to Canada and then the US and had this idea of life. Like I don't know if your mom was the same, but my mom always thought like if you were a bank teller, you were like a very respectable job, even though they probably make like minimum wage, right? It's just because like
mm,
the suit and all that stuff. But coming back to it, when you understood that you were an artist, like you mentioned, like you had that aha moment, hey, I'm really good. I'm an artist. What was like the feedback? Did you have conversations with your mom, with your community, with your family? Was there any kind of issues at that point, or did you have the full support? Like, okay, this is what Tage wants to do because she is pursuing being an entrepreneur and she is doing stuff. She's just not trying to be a starving artist. But what was the feedback with your family specifically?
mm. That's a great question. I don't know if I ever got feedback on my arts per se. I mean, I think people are like, "Oh, that's cool. That's nice." They'll come through and support. But because I've had many different identities as an artist, unfortunately, this notion of a starving artist has in fact been accepted and perpetuated in society, where many artists are, doing many different things outside of our art. Our art becomes our night job and our side hustle, and then we got to get the real paid job. So I've gone that path too, and Blackout grew to be like 11 chapters across the U.S. and like national tours and things like that. I did all of that as a volunteer from grad school and into my several years after that while I worked full time. And I was in my 20s, right? I had a lot of energy and I was like, didn't have children yet, didn't have all this responsibility. So I was coordinating, performing, doing all these things, helping within this collective to grow this national organization. And then my full time job was fundraising. So now I call it resource mobilization. But when I was graduating NYU, I was like, oh shit, what am I going to do now? I have all this cool experience. I have this stuff, but where do I fit in? And I thought the natural place to go was marketing and PR, where I can be creative and use my communications and my business savvy. I was being recruited by an investment bank, but I was like, hell no, I'm not going into the belly of the beast of capitalism. That was clear. So I turned down the high paying investment banking job because they just wanted their diversity. They came looking for their diversity. Um, and I interviewed in advertising and PR and got some offers. And then I also threw my hat into this program called East Harlem Tutorial Program. That was an after school program for Black and Brown kids in East Harlem. And I went there for an education coordinator position, but got interviewed for a development associate position. And I didn't know you could get paid for fundraising. I did that always as a volunteer. And I was like, I went into this old furniture warehouse building turned after school program in East Harlem and compared it to like these Bozell Worldwide and all these ad agencies that had like these glass atriums and elevators. And I was like in my head, what would make my mom proud? I already broke her
Mhm.
heart, but I'm pursuing law. What would make her proud? So I felt like I had to go with the corporate job. I went back to the second interview at East Harlem Tutorial Program because I was like, I'm going to get my interview skills so I can just like really be in negotiation with this corporate job. And then I met the executive director. Oh, 1 second. Um, yeah, I met the executive director, Carmen Vega Rivera, who is also now an ancestor. And she became a mentor to me. But when that interview, Carmen talked about being a young lord, being an artist and activist, came back to her community in El Barrio and turned it from a hole in the wall program to a national model.
Mm.
And I was like, that's who I want to be when I grow up. None of these white men interviewing me in corporate America had that impact, like goosebumps. And instead, I felt them like leering at me.
Yeah. And I think that's like really important what you're kind of saying, right? Like you said, when you were interviewing for the corporate roles, you kind of saw it as, hey, I was just going to be a diversity hire. Is my voice really going to be listened to? Am I going to be heard? And then when, like, you're talking about your mentor, Carmen, which is amazing to kind of see that she kind of gives you a different perspective in life. I want to talk a little bit about Jahaji Sisters because I think that's how I kind of found you. And I saw the connections there and what you kind of do for the community. So back to previously in our conversation, you mentioned about lifting others from the bottom to kind of like let's at the end they help everybody around the world. Can you talk a little bit about Jahaji Sisters in terms of we obviously know what the term is, but what is the belief in there? What are you guys doing, and how can what do you think the impact is currently being happening? Because I can see it as a movement myself, but I'm an outsider for myself. So I would love to get this perspective from yourself specifically.
Yeah. I'm just gonna take a leap into Jahaji Sisters. So yeah, so while I was so I started working at East Harlem Tutorial Program, spent 6.5 years there. And then I transitioned into philanthropy because I was like really burnt out from social service work and I wanted to figure out how to move money to artists. When I went into philanthropy, I kind of like it was so intense. I was getting in the sea of whiteness. It was a very like I was working with young, wealthy individuals, and I disconnected a lot from community. I became an executive director of this philanthropic organization, and it like took everything out of me. I was like working around the clock, and I felt like I had to prove myself. All my imposter syndrome, everything was coming up. And I also had to deal with like just like this dominant white culture that wasn't part of like my everyday lived experience. And during that time is when my mother-in-law asked me, "You're doing all this work out there for white people, for people of color, and everything. When are you going to do something for the women in our community?" So I had done community work before. I was an artist doing like cultural heritage work with the Taij Kumarie Cultural Center. I was part of the Guyana Youth Corps, the Guyana Watch Youth Corps. I used to go to Guyana to do medical missions and went to India on a history project, just did a lot of stuff. But she was like, when are you going to do something for the women? And it felt like a calling in. Right. Remember, that's where I found myself, back in college. It was like really understanding who's the Indo Caribbean woman. And that was March 2007. And she said, let's do something for Women's History Month. I said, okay, mom, if you find me a venue, I'll organize something. The next day she calls me. Pandit Prakash Desai said we could use his Mandir, Bhuvaneshwar Mandir on March 31st. So we started organizing the first Indo-Caribbean Women's Empowerment Summit. It was me and my sister Simone, and then my mother-in-law and her sister Vijay and Gayatri that we started organizing this first summit. And then leading up to it, I always say sometimes, we choose our work, but when we're on purpose, our work chooses us, right? Our dharma, our divine purpose. And as we were leading up to that summit, a young Indo-Caribbean woman by the name of Natasha Rahman was, just trigger warning to your audience, was murdered by her alleged rapist, who, when she finally decided to um, file charges, he was let out on $5,000 bail and slashed her neck. 2 weeks before the first summit, I had one of those, excuse my language, what he asked moments, right? We're Kuli, right? So we get to say that. Um, yeah, and it just, the stakes went from like here to here. It was now a rallying call because leaders in the community, predominantly men, if anything happened back home, related to race or whatever, they were out in the streets protesting. But this happened in our backyard and it was crickets. So we knew we had to become the leaders that the women in our community needed at that moment. It wasn't just a summit, it was building a movement. And then, unfortunately, 2 weeks after, just so like the universe had to just let us know. So 2 weeks after, another Indo-Caribbean woman by the name of Gayatri Hardat was murdered in broad daylight on Atlantic Avenue. She was shot in her head by someone she was her fiance that she was trying to break up with, who was an NYPD. So the summit now is bookended by this. There was no way to deny it anymore. This felt like my calling. This felt like purpose work. And there were so many other women and gender expansive people who shared that. And we found each other in true Jahaji spirit. We found each other. And we've been building a movement since, from 2007.
2007. And the one thing that I've always kind of like, when I really wanted to get this part of you sharing that part, because when you and I had our pre interview to even come on this show, you shared that with me. And I found that so powerful when you said that when you're on purpose, everything kind of like opens and it's meant for you. You really can't take yourself off path. And that's where I kind of look at my life personally. I'm like, okay, well, I've started this journey in myself. It's comparable. But for anybody that's out there in the audience, when you're looking at something like, should I do something? Maybe I shouldn't. And you put that doubt in your mind, the universe is, as long as you start going, your universe is going to propel you where you need to go. And that's what I'm a big proponent of. And as you're mentioning, you guys are setting up 2 weeks before unfortunate incidents kind of happen left, right, and center. And it just drives the message forward that we can't stay silent about this. The late Sri Prakash Gosai, he was a big person in community involvement as well. And I always like to tell, this is just me personally, but I always like to say, like, I was one of his last drummers to play for him before he died. So that's kind of like my little claim to fame, being a little dolak player. But maybe I shouldn't. I told his brother that last year when he was in our area doing a satsang, and I got along with him. But just coming back to it, I think it's just really important when you're talking about, you guys were going to have this women's history event, and it turned into a movement itself. With movements, it started by a little step, right? It's things that just keep going and going and going. What does Jahaji Sisters look like now? Because, like you said, you started that many years ago. Do you see it still as a movement that's still going on, and especially new people coming in? Because one thing that I saw that we chatted about was that you guys were having auditions in the art space, things that you guys are looking to be more proactively in, that you guys do every year. What does that look like right now, as opposed to, hey, when you're really starting at the grassroots with your sister and your mother-in-law and your aunt? It's just really the three of you, sorry, the four of you in total, putting this together to where it is right now.
Well, I would say it's still very much so family oriented. My sister Simone is one of the co-directors. Shavana Jarwar is the other co-director. I've known Shavana since she was a preteen. We started out at Mandir together, danced together, performed together, and then have been building this movement together. So we're family, and we're also Jahajis, right? Many of us are still families. We don't take that lightly. We are a chosen family. We go through it, we work through it, we stay in it. But there's a lot more people now. We have Gabby, who's also on staff. We just hired another new staff person. I won't mention their name because I don't want to steal the thunder. The co-director is announcing it. And we have a volunteer base. We have members. We're looking for another staff person, a direct service manager, so someone who has experience or is an MSW. Please be in touch with us. Yeah, and we've been growing, Jahaji Sisters. We started off as a volunteer organization, and then I think about starting in 2012, we kind of hit a place where we started burning out as volunteers from 2007 to 2012. We kept programs going, but it also got to a point where life changes, me having children, someone else going away to like law school, major life changes. We kind of slowed down a bit. And then in 2016, several of us came back together. I actually held a retreat at my house and we started creating a strategic plan, a vision. And we said, we are going to be a staffed organization. We cannot grow and scale and keep moving, and burning ourselves out in this way. Again, this notion that somehow our purpose work becomes our side hustle or our non-paying, passion project job. While we have the real job, we were like, no, we are going to disrupt that. We created a plan, we had our vision, and we've been able to manifest it. We've been able to manifest it. We were a staffed organization with like a direct service component, an advocacy component, a membership, an arts and activism residency, like just doing big things and still grounded in this notion of Jahaji, a family. And I'm not going to make it seem all like sunshine and rainbows because we're all part of family. That's one thing we got in common. In family, you got your good, you got your bad, and you got the areas where you're going to have to like just do the work to grow.
That's a growing thing, as I kind of mentioned. It always comes back. One thing I'm really impressed by you, Tage, is that everything that you've said, it always comes back to family. Jahaji, regardless of wherever you're at in life and everything like that. And I think it's commendable. What would you recommend, as we're coming up to the last question here for you, Tage? What would be your advice to somebody who maybe was on that path of 17-year-old Tage, wanting to do more, do something for the community, lift as they kind of rise themselves, kind of faced by maybe they're going to college or they're going to high school, they're going to something where they don't have the opportunity to basically grow into their own shell, but they want to make a difference. What would your advice be to basically 17-year-old Tage?
Hmm. It would be well, there's this quote in the Gita where Krishna talks about dharma to Arjuna, and he said it's better to fail, pursuing your own dharma, which is your true purpose while you're on this earth, than to succeed and excel in someone else's. So it's better to fail pursuing your own passion and your own purpose than to succeed in someone else's. So that's the essence of what I'd like to channel from Bhagwan Krishna to my young 17-year-old self, because I think this fear of failure, which is very real for us coming from, our lineages. It sometimes feels like we're carrying, everybody on our shoulders and we got to succeed,
Yep.
And we just push ourselves, and we sometimes are pushing to meet other people's dreams and other people's expectations on what they want of us, right? But we can never make ourselves happy by trying to make everybody else happy. And happiness is actually contagious, right? So if we stop trying to do the work to make everybody else happy and actually have an embodied experience of happiness and center our own happiness, that becomes contagious, and those around us will also be happy. So I would say center your own joy, center your own happiness. Things doesn't have to be so hard. We are worthy of softness and ease, right? That's why our ancestors worked so hard, and I'm sure they did not want us to work as hard as they did. So we
Oh,
get to have that. So I'll just say follow your own passion, your own light, your own purpose, and only you can know what that is. Others can guide us, they can be mirrors for us, they can ask questions to help us get clear, but they don't get to tell us, they don't get to decide for us. That's what it means to be an empowered, sovereign being.
that's so beautiful. Usually, funny story. Usually, I end off this by asking, "What's your message to the world?" But that was it. So we need to get into that. So Tage, I can't thank you enough. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for coming on our show. How can people get a hold of you, connect with you, even with the three entities, or they want to connect with you personally? Where can they get that done?
Um, you can follow me on Instagram, DM me. I check my DMs. It's Taij Kumarie. Um, and also Media Sutra, you can follow. That's my company. It's at Media Sutra Inc. or Jahaji Sisters at Jahaji underscore sisters. And then if anyone wants to email me, you could send it to mediasutrainfo at gmail. Mediasutrainfo at gmail.
There we go. So, like we said, we can't thank you enough. I want to thank the audience for taking the time out of the day, whether you're catching this live at 5 p.m. on Mondays or you're catching the replay. Want to thank you so much. And we have to bring Tage back on a future episode to kind of hear the kind of cool growths. And you just never know. I might be doing a show at one of their events. You just never know. But want to thank everybody so much again. Have an amazing day, and we'll see you guys next week. Take care.